Hello, friends, and welcome back to the second installment of our series with Rabbi Zarnighian, exploring Purim through Teshuvot. Today is the second installment. We'll be exploring drinking on Purim, which I hope everyone had an amazing Purim, and we'll use this information, this practical information, for next cycle. Bezrat Hashem, next week we'll have the final installment. Um, and we're obviously excited to have Rabbi Zarnighian for many more series going forward. For the Miami folk, going announcement that we just launched a study group initiative of Mishneh Torah's Hilchot Chametz U'Matzah. So I highly recommend everyone to hop onto that and to take advantage. Next few days, we're going to be learning together. And also, a few days ago, we came out with Rabbi Dayan Verdugo's book on baking matzah, and the halachot of that and how to do it on your own. So highly recommend getting yourself a copy with that. Thank you everyone for being here. We apologize for the time changes, and the time clocks will be on the same page, everyone together very soon. And so thank you everyone for being here live. Thank you everyone who's going to be listening afterwards. And Chacham, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ohad. It's always a zechut and a pleasure to be with all of you and the rest of the Chavurah members who listen at their own pace and time. One thing I do have to make note of is that while initially I wanted to speak about drinking on Purim because it was of relevance, minyane de'oma, relating to contemporary and practical application of celebrating Purim, it's also true for Pesach, because don't forget, it's not like there's no alcohol at the Seder, and we also have Arba Kosor on top of that. And it's also true in a sense year-round, insofar as understanding what our limits should be when it comes to drinking, how that ought to be done, under what circumstances, and so on and so forth. So in a way, it is pretty universal. I want to begin with a very interesting series of pesukim from Mishle ben Sirah. People don't usually quote Mishle ben Sirah. I think that's to our detriment. It's a wonderful set of Mishalim from Yeshua ben Sirah of the 2nd century. Those of you who are in the know should know that the Gemara from time to time has no problem quoting Ben Sirah, and you take the good where you can, and where Ben Sirah doesn't always make all that much sense, we move on. But here Ben Sirah makes a lot of sense. So this is from the Kahana edition. As of the 1970s and onward, they have begun uncovering much of the original Hebrew in Ben Sirah. And so here you have from the original Hebrew text relating to drinking. Ben Sirah says, "Bimkom hayane al tishpoch siach," where you are involved in drinking wine. Over here, it's lav dafka, not necessarily wine, but drinking of any kind, in all likelihood, as we will see momentarily. Do not go about chirping. It's not a place for chirping, because why not? In all these circumstances, whether it's the chirping during a banquet, or playing instruments without a mizmor, without a set of lyrics, or being too wise or too smart when it is not the right time, what is the purpose? Of what use is it? A few pesukim forward, Ben Sirah, in the same parak though, still in parak Lamed Aleph, Ben Sirah says, Lemi yayin chayim. Wine is a double-edged sword. It could be Sam HaMavet, it could be Sam HaChaim, the elixir of life or the elixir of death. So to whom is wine considered the source of life. Le'enosh im yishten b'matkunto. It's considered a source of life to humankind, to he who drinks it in its appropriate quantity. Ma chayim chaser hayayin. What? Because, and I love this. I love this. What is life if it is missing wine? Shu mereshit lesimcha notzar. For it was created from the very beginning for the sake of joy. But again, if you connect pasuk lamed zayin and lamed chet, it's only created for a source of joy if it is drunk b'matkunto. And conversely, that tells you also that chayim is primarily for the purposes of joy. It's a very beautiful lesson from Ben Sira. And we're going to see, actually, that what we all know from the Barachi Nafshi, Tehillim echoes this idea as well. Right? That wine is that which gladdens the heart of mankind. Ben Sira is borrowing from Tehillim, of course. But Chachamim also point out, based on other Pesukim, that wine also has its other functions, not just the function of gladdening the heart. In Sefer Devarim, Perek Yod Dalet, we have the institution of Maaser Sheni. Maaser Sheni is the tithing that is, you have two options over here, what to do with it. You can either take the Maaser Sheni and go to Yerushalayim to redeem it and consume it there, or you can give it to the Kohen. So when it comes to the Maaser Sheni, the Torah says you have Pidyon al Matbea. You can redeem it on coins that are then given and deposited into the vaults and funds of the Bet Midrash or the Mishkan. But with that, the Torah says you're supposed to do in Yerushalayim bechol asher te'aveh nafshecha, with whatever your soul desires. Rav Saadia Gaon already points out over here that the lashon of ta'ava is used in reference to is used to refer to those foods, those objects that are not typically consumed. They're not consumed on a daily basis. So you're able to consume with this basically all food that is cholin, all food that is not consecrated for the Beit HaMikdash. If you have Maaser Sheni in the form of wine that comes from a vineyard that you have, you can drink that. If it's with cattle, whatever the case may be, that's all yours, no problem. But the condition is you have to eat it there, within the confines of the in ancient times, within the confines of the Mishkan, and then post-Mishkan period within the confines of some say the Beit HaMikdash, some say the old city of Yerushalayim. That's the Machloket HaRishonim. But from here you see that the consumption of meat and the consumption of wine is definitely not something that's inherently bad. It's not inherently wrong. It's not condemned by the Torah. This is something that is very relevant to point out, even though we all know this as Jews. We know this intuitively. But it's not so obvious to many others in the world. You take, for example, many Protestant Christians who learn the same Tanakh as we have, but have a different understanding of what yain and tirosh and shechar are. If you speak to some Protestant pastors and ministers, they'll tell you it's referring to grape juice. So it poses a lot of problems in context, contextually and grammatically, but it's a discussion for another time. So, having said that, the Gemara Masechet Eruvin makes a very interesting comment regarding the secondary purpose of wine. Amar Rabbi Chanin, lo nivra yain ela lenachem avelim ulshalem schar lareshaim. Wine was created. The Gemara often uses the term ela. It's only for the purpose of X, Y, or Z. So a lot of the Mefarshim point out that ela means, generally speaking, the primary function, not exclusive function, but the primary function of wine is to console avelim, God forbid, the mourners, and to reward the wicked. Like the pasuk says, you should give shechar to he who has lost, and meaning someone who is off the beaten path, and wine unto those who are embittered. It's the remedy for both in some ways. Amar Rechim bar Papa, the Gemara goes on further to say, somewhat more positively, Kol she'en yain nishpach betoch beto kamayim eno bichlal beracha. Very, very interesting. Very interesting. Anybody whose home does not have wine pouring in it in abundance is not included in the blessing. What blessing? The blessing that I believe is in Parashat Beshalach, if I recall correctly, where the pasuk says, "Uverach et lachmecha bet memecha." Right, and the pasuk goes on to say, "Va'asiroti machala mikirbecha." So the Torah promises Am Yisrael, if you follow in the ways of the Torah, that it will bless our food, ve'et memecha, and our water. Right. Now, 1 second. Just as you can purchase bread with the maaser sheni money that we spoke about earlier, af mayim shenikach bechesef maaser. So too can you purchase water with the maaser sheni money. Umay minhu yain. And what does it mean? Ve'et memecha, that means wine. Hold on 1 second. Ve'ka karele mayim. What's going on over here? The Torah says water, and you're telling me it's wine. Don't spit in my face and tell me it's raining. Water is not wine. Says the Gemara very interestingly. I nishpach beveto kamayim ika beracha v'ila la. In other words, the Gemara is saying the Torah is alluding to the fact that wine, in a way, is water if you treat it like water. It's not literally water, but if you treat it like water, then it's bichlal beracha. Just like water is in immense, unless you're a nomad in the desert, like we were for the first 40 years. But the Torah here is, of course, speaking about our arrival in Eretz Yisrael. Just like water, when we settled in Eretz Yisrael, was not really an object. Thank God we had enough of it. The Gemara is saying, if you treat your wine in the same manner, it'll be included in the bracha of water that you won't ever lack for it, right? The Gemara says something very important here at the end, though. Amar Rabbi Ilai. These statements they seem disconnected, but they are not. Bishlosha devarim adam nikar. A person's true character is known through 3 things: bechoso, uvchiso, uvchaaso, ve'amrela af besahako. So the Rishonim debate what these terms exactly mean, but for our purposes, bechoso is his drinking. A person is known by how he reveals himself when he is drinking. I'm carefully using my words. I'm not saying drunk for good reason. Uvchiso, and also with his pouch, his pocket, meaning with the way he spends his money. Uvchaaso, and also with his demeanor in a state of anger. And also, alternatively, a person is also known through his sense of humor. Good advice for dating. If you ever want to know a person's true self, observe these 4 characteristics. I think that Rabbi Eli's memra over here is placed here and not elsewhere, specifically because of the clause where he mentions bechoso. It's very nice to have wine that's pouring in your home in abundance, but don't let it get to your head. Don't go crazy with it, because if you go crazy with it, not everybody has the best demeanor when their kos is too full. Midrash Tanchuma in Parashat Shemini comments very beautifully about the indulgence in wine. I'm reading from the middle where the last word of the line says Lechach. Lechach HaKadosh Baruch Hu mitzaveh al Aharon. For the reasons that the Midrash discussed earlier regarding the damages that are brought about from drinking wine in excess abundance. The Midrash also over here has the famous adage, Nichnas yain yatsa sod, that when wine goes into you, the secrets come out. Sometimes not so, the secrets that are not so good, right? And that it can damage a person's da'at and prevent them from teaching Torah properly and performing mitzvot properly. More on that later, by the way. For that reason, because Aharon and the Kohanim are the ones who set the example for the Jewish people, they're the Moreh Hora'ah, they're the ones who instruct halakha to Am Yisrael, and they're the ones who are required to have proper da'at, proper sense of mental competence in order to serve in the Mishkan, the Beit HaMikdash. Therefore, the mitzvah of, or the caution of excess drinking was specifically given to Aharon and his descendants in order to, maintain their qualifications to serve Borei Olam and the Jewish people. Therefore, the pasuk says, "Yain v'shechar al tesh ata u'banecha itach," etc., etc. Now, the Midrash over here says very interestingly, "V'lati es savur shem al she'avar techilat tziviti etchem k'shbeit hamikdash kayam v'atem mishamshim bo." Don't think that you Kohanim, don't think that this caution, this warning, only applies to you initially when you were serving, and now, with the absence of the Beit HaMikdash, it's not so relevant, right? Don't think that. Because you may mistakenly think that, because the Torah says, only when you enter the Oel Moed, only when you enter the Mishkan, the Beit HaMikdash, is it going to be a problem. Says the Midrash, no. Really, you have to always be cautious. As it says, Chukat Olam Dorotechem. Obviously, the Peshat over here is not this. The Peshat is Chukat Olam, means that this Isur applies, even God willing, when the Beit HaMikdash is rebuilt in the future. Prohibitions still apply to Kohanim being restricted in service when they are drunk. The Gemara says famously, it's afilu revi'ita kos shel yain. Even if you're having just 3 ounces or so of wine, that's already enough to invalidate a kohen temporarily. Therefore, you should be diligent in guarding yourself from wine. It is the archetype, the symbol of curse. Shekenhu omer benoach. Look at what happened the first time we're introduced to wine in the Torah. Noach drinks his alcohol in his misery, or perhaps in his state of excess simcha from being saved. That's also machloket in the Mefarshim. But the result is not good. It doesn't yield well for Noach. Rabbeinu Bachye, in his Perush al Torah, also makes note of this, and he says that yain is a binyan of sorts. It's an example that the Torah uses when referring to alcoholic beverages for specific purposes. Sometimes wine is specifically used to the exclusion of other alcoholic beverages, like by the Nazir, right? Although even there, some caution the Nazirim from drinking alcohol. But other times, where it's not clear, where it's not explicitly referring to wine. Rabbeinu Bachya writes in his Perush al Torah that this is actually a binyan av. It's a prime example used to refer to all alcoholic beverages that we should be cautious of. Similar to the pasuk lo tevashel gedi b'chalev imo, don't cook a kid in its mother's milk, right? That's a binyan av. It's not referring to a kid in particular and only in its mother's milk. Okay, so the Gemara in Masechet Megillah, this is the famous passage that everybody has 110 different opinions of with regard to celebrating Purim. The Gemara talks about the famous statement of Rava, Mechayev inish lebesume befuria. A person is obligated to, these two words are the operative terms that are ambiguous, so I don't really want to translate them. But for the purposes of just getting through the Gemara, a person is obligated to become drunk on Purim ad la yada ben arur Haman v'aruch Mordechai, until he cannot tell the difference between cursed is Haman and blessed is Mordechai. There's a lot of discussion about what that means also. What exactly is that level of intoxication? Then the Gemara goes on to talk about the story of Rabbi Zera, where he and Rabbah had a Purim Seudah together. Things got a little out of hand, and the Gemara says this is also a question of how you properly vocalize the Gemara here. It's not so clear, but the Gemara says that Rabbi Zera Rabbah was shachte Rabbi Zera. He killed him. Meiri says sachte. He squeezed him. Either way, didn't go well for Rabbi Zera. Lemachar ba'ei rachameh. He prayed for him the next day, ve'achyeh, and he came back to life. Leshana, next year they met together. I don't know why they met together the next year. I mean, first time didn't really yield good results for him, but they met the next year. Amar le, and he told him, let the master come, let's have the seudah together. Amar le, la bechal sha'ata b'sha'ata mitrachesh nisa. Miracles don't happen all the time, right? Miracles don't happen all the time. To what extent this mechtechiyat metim occurred? Some of the Mefarshim point out that he was unconscious, not that he was actually dead. Regardless, it tells you that even something as simple as losing your faculties, going unconscious, is not a laughing matter. And they were willing to forego the entire seudah out of fear for this happening again. The Gemara ends off on this point, by the way. And based on that, there are a number. This is not the accepted position that Harambam, the Rif, and the Shulchan Aruch take, but a number of Rishonim take the position as follows. Sefer HaMeorot, Rabbi Shimon HaMe'ili, 13th century, from Provence. He was a very, very strongly opinionated Rishon. He often differed from many of his colleagues on certain areas, particularly when it came to, he's most famous for his opposition to the Kabbalah. He's one of the first Rishonim to very vehemently oppose some of the teachings of the early Mekubalim. So he writes in his Sefer HaMeorot, which is his set of chidushim to the Talmud Bavli, as follows: the Hay de Amrina b'Gemara ad la yada ben Baruch Mordechai la'arur Haman ad velo ad bichlal. He's quantifying for you here the measurement of the appropriate level of inebriation. To what extent is a person allowed to get drunk? To the point where he is right before being unable to tell the difference between Arur Haman, Baruch Mordechai. We're going to define later on what that statement is referring to. Most Rishonim are of the opinion, based on a passage in the Talmud Yerushalmi, that it's in reference to the literal statement of singing that we make after the Megillah is read. Talmud Yerushalmi says that the Sibur then sings, Arur Haman, Baruch Mordechai, Arura Zeresh, Baruch Esther, etc., etc. V'gam Harbuna Zachor L'Tov, right? So if a person cannot clearly sing along to this, that's already a problem, right? That's what most Rishonim understand that reference to what that is in reference to. Iname, he says, alternatively, it's an exaggeration because Chachamim always speak in exaggerated terms. The Gemara in Arachin famously says, Dibru Chachamim b'lishon Havai. Aval shichrut hu isur gamor. He says, and the reason why we would use this cop-out answer that Chachamim were speaking in exaggerated terms, it's not something that we ideally resort to, is because intoxication is otherwise a serious prohibition. You know, I told you, the Sefer HaMeorot goes crazy sometimes. He says there's no greater transgression than this. Hu hagorem legilui arayot ushfichut damim ukama isurin ve'af la'avodah zara ukfira ba'ikar ve'en zo simcha ktuva b'mikra. It leads to the three cardinal sins: murder, adultery, and avodah zara, and heresy, and horrible, terrible things. And you're going to tell me, 1 second, Rabbi Shimon, you're a big rabbi. You should know that the Torah refers, in other places in the Mikra, in the Tanakh, we have references to wine being a source of joy, of simcha. So he says, no, that's not what it's talking about. It's talking about, like what Ben Sira was mentioning in the very beginning. It's simcha to he who drinks it in its proper portion, not to he who abuses it. The Meiri in his Bet Bechira also echoes this idea, and he brings down the thing that we mentioned regarding what is cursed Haman and Baruch Mordechai. And at the very end over here, he says, 3 lines from the bottom, Ve'amar shechayav leitbasem, a very important term that we're going to focus on actually towards the end. Person is chayav leitbasem. You'll notice the term that the Gemara uses is not lehishtaker. It's not to get the biblical Hebrew term for intoxication. It's leitbasem. I mentioned earlier that that's a really an ambiguous term, so we'll define it in a moment. But until he doesn't clearly know what he is saying, right? So that's what we mentioned earlier. But here Meiri offers a very interesting chidush. He says, this position of the Gemara is actually a rejected opinion, as we have explained, because the result that is that ultimately yields Rabbi Zera's quote unquote death is proof that the Gemara rejects the position that you have to drink at all. There's no mitzvah to drink on Purim according to this position, and this is also the position of one of the Talmidei Harif, Rabbi, I think his name was Rabbi Ephraim ibn Masud, if I recall correctly, and in his Chidushim he also brings this position down, although Meiri does not quote him by name. So he's honest though and says, Ugdolei HaMechaberim, Harambam says, Ad sheyiradem, you drink until you fall asleep. And that is true, right? Harambam, in his Hilchot Megillah V'Chanukah, writes that the chova, the seudah, the obligation of having the seudat Purim is to have basar, very important clause over there, and to prepare a seudah na'ah, meaning not like your meal set up during the rest of the week, but something nicer than that, kefi asher timtza yado, based on what you are able to procure. You don't need to have, like the Gemara says, a meal ke seudat Shlomo HaMelech bishat malchuto. You don't need to have a meal like King Solomon in his royal banquets, but something more than you would normally do, right? To make it special. Ve'shoteh yain, and you drink wine, until the point where you fall asleep and use the tipsiness to fall asleep. And the Harambam goes on to say that, it's more important for a person to not lose sight of the main purpose of the Seudah, which is really to gladden the hearts of the poor, the orphans, the widows, and converts, those who don't have families to celebrate with. This is very important because aside from the ethical standards we should set for our families and ourselves when we have meals, whether it's a Shabbat meal, a Yom Tov meal, a Purim meal, to invite guests and to be hospitable, we also learn that there is no mitzvah to drink on Purim. Harambam never we could look and search. He never talks about a chovah or a mitzvah to drink on Purim. He says there is a mitzvah to have a seudah. Within the seudah, it happens to be one of the components is wine. And here Harambam is specifically referring to wine as wine and not as a binyan av, like we said, not as an archetype, not as an example to just refer to all alcoholic beverages. That's not to say that a person is forbidden from consuming other alcoholic beverages. That's not what I'm saying. But it is not a component of the Seudat Purim, and as we're going to see, it's not a component of anything that halakha prescribes for Shabbat, Yom Tov, for anything for that matter. The only exception to this rule is something that the Gemara refers to. The Gemara Pesachim refers to if a person lacks wine in the city, where you absolutely under no circumstances have wine or grape juice near you, then you can use Chamar Hamdina. You could use what people treat as a substitute for wine in the city, in the locale, I should say, and Havdalah can be made on that. That is the only exception. Ashkenazim, based on a position of the Rosh, also adopt this for Kiddusha Rabbah, Kiddush of the day, but that's not the position adopted by Sephardim, and it's also not something that Maran allows if you have wine available. And that's the position Harambam takes in Ilchot Deot. Perek He, Harambam says that drinking is only permitted when it's achila, if it's drinking within the meal. So much so that Harambam says a Talmid Chachamim should not drink wine unless it's to help him digest food. Anybody who gets drunk, he's a sinner, and it's repulsive. He loses his wisdom this way. If you're getting drunk with those who are of the less honorable type of people, shall we say, you desecrate God's name in public this way. And he goes on to say not to drink in the afternoon unless it's within the meal. Very, very interesting over here. If you recall, Harambam says that the wine that is drunk during the Seudat Purim is during the Seudah. In Ilchot Deot, Harambam tells us why it is that you have wine during the meal. He tells you it's to help you digest, and that if it's within the meal, you're not going to get drunk. As, by the way, we all know, I presume all of us know that experience has shown us that that's not entirely true, depending on how much you eat and depending on the type of wine and how much wine you drink. But generally speaking, if you drink like a normal person and eat like a normal person, you're not going to become intoxicated through this during the meal. And that's Harambam's whole point. Harambam's whole point is to drink to the point where you are sleepy. The questions I want to raise at this point that will be addressed are as follows. Why wine in particular and not some other alcoholic beverage? Number one. And number two, what is Harambam's lesson in the Seudah based on the following passages? In Ilchot Shebitat Yom Tov, you'll notice very interestingly, Harambam outlines some very similar features in the Seudat Yom Tov versus the Seudat Purim. In both cases, we have a mitzvah to have the meal, and you have a mitzvah to have wine. However, one key difference in the way Yom Tov is celebrated versus Purim is that Purim is celebrated for men, women, and children through the Seudah as one component of celebration, whereas for Yom Tov, it's subjective. Rambam says for the kids, you buy them nuts and candies and stuff like that. For women, you buy them nice clothing and jewelry. And only by men, והאנשים אוכלים בשר ושותים יין. שאין שמחה אלא בבשר ואין שמחה אלא ביין. There's a lot of discussion about this famous clause in the Mishnah Torah, where Harambam says that simcha is achieved through eating meat and drinking wine. The Gemara actually doesn't have that clause of eating meat. So there's a whole discussion as to where Harambam derives that idea from, but that's not for now. So, and of course, another very famous, parallel between Yom Tov and Purim is the priority being given to those who don't have families to celebrate with. Rambam goes on to mention the ger, the yatom, the almanah, to invite them, to feed them, and if not, he quotes from Hosea Hanavi that a curse will befall the Jewish people if they ignore those who are lacking family or food from joining them in the Seudat Yom Tov. So, in every regard, Chachamim seem to equate the Seudat Purim to the Seudat Yom Tov, except for this one area of women and children celebrating in a different respect on Yom Tov. And there's a very interesting analysis as to why that is. That one of our dear friends, who many of you know, Avraham Moshe from New York, published ma'amar in one of YU's journals recently on why that is. In Ilchot Shabbat, forgive me, Harambam goes on in the same perek to mention that when a person eats and drinks on the Yom Tov, lo yimashech bayain, do not overindulge in the wine, uvischok uvkalut rosh, and in chivalry and in doing nonsensical things. שהשכרות והשיחוק הרבה בקלות הראש, אין השמחה אלא הוללות ושכלות. It's if you drink and are lightheaded in excess, then this is not the form of simcha the Torah talks about, but it's actually a form of foolishness and idiocy. And the beautiful line Harambam ends off with, the Torah tells us very famously in the Kalalot at the end of Devarim that many of the tragedies will befall us because you did not serve Borei Olam with joy and with gladness of the heart due to your overabundance. Halamata, what do you learn from this? Serving Borei Olam has to be done with simcha. But here's the takeaway. ואי אפשר לעבוד את השם לא מתוך שחוק ולא מתוך קלות ראש ולא מתוך שכרות. You can't serve God if you're being silly, or if you are a fool, or if you are drunk. What's Harambam's source for this idea? If you take a look at Yalkut Shimoni, 12th century or 11th century collection of Midrashim, we have Rabbi Akiva making a very interesting comment regarding procuring food for Shabbat. Even though we are taught that a person shouldn't go broke by sponsoring his Shabbat meals, Yikach Adam basar me'at ve'yain me'at, you should still buy a little bit of meat and wine for Shabbat. Ve'al yarbe bebasar ve'yain, but do not overdo meat and wine. Interesting that Rabbi Akiva points out the added clause of meat over here, whereas Harambam did not mention that. Harambam does not talk about overindulging in meat, but rather just wine. based on a pasuk in Mishle, Al te'eh besove yain bezolei basar lamo. Do not be among those who are habitual wine drinkers or who are gluttonous for meat. Okay. So from everything we have seen so far, we see that moderation is a key takeaway. Sefer Yereim is of the opinion, he's one of the few Rishonim who says this, but he's of the opinion that the mitzvah of Simchat Yom Tov is also subjective, not only for the categories that we mentioned, that kids celebrate Yom Tov one way, women celebrate another way, men another way. He says each category is a generalization for each group of the Jewish society. In other words, the Gemara is telling us that generally speaking, kids are happy when you buy them candy and toys. Generally speaking, women are happy when you buy them clothing and jewelry. And men are generally speaking happy by having meat and wine. But he says, Velo yain bilvad. It's not just wine. Ela kol davar shemesameach et ha'adam, v'chol davar shenoda she'asimcha hu lo, hayav adam la'asot. It's anything that really brings joy to you. Obviously, joy within the confines of doing it in a kosher way, right? That's it's a minority opinion that Rabbi Eliezer Imetz, the author of the Yereim, 12th century Rishon, records. He's from the early Baalei Tosafot, so it's a very early precedent for this position. It's generally not accepted lahalacha, but it is, something that is worth being aware of. And it also comes up when people have intolerances. If a person is miserable by drinking wine, either because he's intolerant of the wine, or let's say a person is a vegetarian, and that's not to say that performing mitzvot are subject to our feelings, but in this particular case, Sefer Yereim would tell us that a person who would be brought to a state of grief or anguish by consuming these things would not have to partake in them on Yom Tov if they make him upset. Do something else that makes you happy. I'm going to be a contrarian here with Rabbi David Abu Daram, the great Rishon from Spain, 14th century. His Perush to the Chagim and Tefillot is perhaps one of the most comprehensive and simple and best that exists. I don't know if an English translation of it exists, but if it doesn't, if one does not exist, then something that's very much worthy of a translation into English. So he writes that drinking and getting drunk are things that we know our Chachamim condemn. So how could Chachamim make an exception for Purim? He's assuming that we accept that Gemara and Megillah, right? He says something very interesting. He quotes from the Megillah, middle of the passage over here. Shneemar bayom hashavi'i ketov lev hamelech bayayin, amar lehavi et Vashti Amalka. It was during Achashverosh's initial wine banquet that Vashti was summoned, and that Esther was put in her place, and that Esther ultimately would end the Gezerah against the Jewish people at her own wine banquet. He says, Uva Esther tachtea al yedei mishteh, and Esther was also brought in her place in another wine banquet, as we read that Achashverosh made a second banquet, Et Mishteh Esther, the banquet of Esther. And the same applies by Haman, like we said, right? That he was taken down literally and metaphorically at the third wine banquet, where Ahashverosh says the famous words, "Agam lichboshet et malka iti babayit, ini babayit." Are you coming to subdue, quote unquote, the queen in my own confines? And that's when Haman's fate was sealed. Therefore, ולכן חייבו להשתכר בפורים, מפני שבא הנס בעבור משתה היין שעשתה אסתר. ועתה יהיה נזכר הנס הגדול בשתיית היין. He says, normally, Chachamim say don't drink. Don't get intoxicated, rather. Getting intoxicated is very bad. It leads to horrible things and it leads to terrible outcomes. However, here Abu Dara makes the argument that getting drunk on Purim is the exception to the rule. You're allowed to get drunk on Purim because it's the only time of year where upstanding Jews would do that. And why do they do that? Why do they perform this unusual thing of getting drunk? To show the world that the Yeshua, the salvation of the Jewish people during the whole Purim episode, came about during the wine banquet where people are normally drunk. So that's a very interesting position of Abu Daram, and it's one that, if you ask me, is maybe a limud zechut, is an opinion that those who do get drunk on Purim can rely on within the means of being reasonable and being safe. Obviously, Rabbi David Abu Daram would also agree that where a person is causing a chilul Hashem due to his intoxication, there are no exceptions to chilul Hashem that warrants a person to take the bullet instead of doing it. It's yehereg val yavor. Okay. Yerushalmi in Sanhedrin Perek Chet is, according to many commentators, according to many of the Mefarshim, the source for where Harambam derives this idea that you go to sleep during the Purim meal. Where does it say you get drunk till you sleep? So the Yerushalmi says that wine and sleep is a very good thing for the wicked of the world, and it's a very good thing for them, and it's a terrible thing for the tzaddikim, for the righteous. Amar Rabbi Abahu, however, Rabbi Abahu says, "Ubilvad yain imrov shena." It's only a bad thing for tzaddikim if it's wine with a lot of sleeping. If you're sleeping in order to alleviate the symptoms of the intoxication, then that's a good thing, right? Amar Rabbi Yonatan, Yeshenim hen kim'a mipenei sheteh datan meyushevet. They are allowed to sleep a little bit so they could get back their faculties and be normal again. That is a good thing. That's not a bad thing. The next couple of passages, I'm going to end off with this because I know we're pressed on time over here and there's so much that we could discuss further. But the next couple of passages basically are meant to prove that the Itbasem is different than getting drunk. The Yerushalmi in Masechet Pesachim, for example, talks about a particular Roman aristocrat who saw one of the Talmidei Chachamim, Rabbi Yehuda Bar Ilai, who was not doing so well. He didn't take alcohol too well. And she saw him one day after Pesach holding his head from what seems to be like a hangover. But he was happy at this point. And she says, Saba, Saba, oh elderly man, or senior, maybe it's a term of seniority. Chada min telat midin it bach. You have one of three things is going on with you right now. Or shetueh hamar, you're either drunk, or malveh beribit, or you're so happy because you're making all this money through lending with interest, through usury. And you see from here, by the way, that the stereotype is a very old one. Or at megadel hazirim, or at megadel hazirimat, or you're raising pigs. I haven't seen any of the Mefarshim address why raising pigs would make a rabbi happy. But this is my chidush. My chidush is that pigs were one of the animals that were forbidden to be raised in Eretz Israel. And if you were raising pigs, it was a hot commodity. You had a monopoly on it, and you can charge a lot. And for the same reason as lending money with interest, it would make the rabbi happy because he made a lot of money from it. He told this Roman aristocrat, may you die for saying this, because I am none of these things. I am none of these things. Instead, what am I? I'm happy because Ela ulfane shechiachli. I'm happy because of the Torah that I learned. As we read in Kohelet, Chochmat Adam Ta'ir Panav. A person's chokhmah makes him, it gladdens his face, it brightens his face. From here, you can understand the Gemara in Baba Batra Daf Ayin Gimel. The Gemara in Baba Batra talks about Rabbi Bar Chana, who was traveling with some Bedouins in the desert. It's a fascinating Gemara because this Gemara actually ties into using archaeological evidence as admissible proof in Bet Din. It's often quoted in that context. But for our purposes, the Gemara is talking about some Bedouins that took Rabbi Bar Chana on a little journey, and he noticed them taking the dirt, sniffing it, and they claimed they knew how far away they were from water. They did it again, they were closer, and sure enough, even though he was suspicious, he gave them some controlled dirt, and they were able to tell that it was fake. It was not the real deal from the area they were in. And he said, oh my God, they're right. They know what they're talking about. There must be some science behind sniffing the dirt and knowing how far away the water is. And he eventually takes him to Mete Midbar, to where those who passed away in the generation of Moshe Rabbeinu were buried. And the Gemara says, he showed him their faces. He says, how do they look like? Says Rabbi Bar Chana, they looked, they looked like, if you translate this literally, like those who were drunk. Tosafot says, no, it's not referring to those who were drunk. It was referring to those who were happy. They looked like a person who has drunk enough alcohol that it just makes him happy. And he says that's in accordance with another Gemara in Sanhedrin that says, that those who passed away in the generation of Moshe Rabbeinu in the wilderness have a portion in the world to come. So to speak, that, their death was a kapara for them, was an atonement for them, and that's why their faces now look perhaps in a mummified form. I don't know. I wasn't there. But look glad and happy. The Gemara in Sukkah also in source 18 talks about enhancing songs that are performed with instruments by that they're enhanced by singing. The Vasume Kala, right? Or excuse me, the reverse, that the singing of the mouth is enhanced by Klei David Melech Israel, through the instruments of David Melech Israel, right? To enhance the voice, to enhance the singing. What do you learn from that? You learn that there's a certain sweetness, there's a certain upgrade that's brought about when the term bisum is used. I don't know. It's not explicit, but Korban Netanel, I found only this year, subscribes to this theory. One of the commentators on the Halachot of Rabbeinu Asher, and he says that bisum and reviyah and shichrut are three different categories of drinking. When the Torah refers to complete outright intoxication, the term rivui, marveh, is used in Aramaic. But when the Torah is referring to a lighter level, the term leit basem is used, or bisum is used. And this theory of different levels of intoxication is also recorded in countless other areas of halacha. I only brought down one example from Harambam's Hilchot Mekach, from Harambam's Hilchot Mechira and the laws of sales, Perek Chaftet. Harambam says very interestingly, Hashikor Mekach Umimkaro Memkar. If a person is intoxicated and he engages in a transaction, or he gives a gift, then the transaction is valid. However, v'im higia leshichuto shelot, ve'hu hashikor she'oseh ve'eno yodea ma oseh, en ma'asav kelum. He has the equivalent. If a person is so intoxicated to the point where he's like Lot in the Torah, I don't know. I don't have to spell out what that is. Harambam tells you though, it's somebody who's so intoxicated that he has no idea what he's doing, and he also has no recollection. If he wakes up from sleeping it off, and you tell him you did X, Y, and Z, he says, "I don't remember any of that." So such an individual is considered like a shoteh. He's like one who has no mental faculties to be considered a functioning human being, and so there's a legal term for this. It escapes me, but that is the ultimate level of drunkenness that a person can reach. Harambam in Ilchot Shechita also brings this level of shichrut down, that a person who is drunk can do shechita, but not if he's drunk to shichruto shelot. If he's that drunk, then his shechita is invalid. Right? So, last source, I promise, last source, Yerushalmi in Kiddushin, Amar Rabbi Chizkiah, B'Shem Rabbi Kohen, B'Shem Rav, all the way to the name of Rav. Atid Adam liten din v'cheshbon al kol she'rat eino v'lo achal. A person is going to give din v'cheshbon. You're going to have to answer to God one day if you do not enjoy the things which your eyes see. We are not commanded to be hermits or monks. We are to enjoy life and enjoy the things that we see, with all the things that are good, but with moderation. Rabbi Elazar chashash lahada shemuata. Rabbi Elazar was uber frum. He was so religious, and he was so worried that he would have to answer to God one day if he didn't take in all of the world's delights. And so he umatzmiach le pritin ve'achil behon mikol mila chada b'shata. Anytime he had the opportunity to say a shechianu on a new fruit, he would do it. To enjoy, to thank Borei Olam for the goodness of the world, for the renewal in our fruits, in our chagim, in the opportunities we have to celebrate with each other. But not to lose sight of the big picture, not to make a fool of oneself, and not to lose one's mental faculties in the process. There are further sources I have over here regarding the terms that Targum, Onkelos, and other midrashim use with regard to defining wine as specifically wine, or wine sometimes as just a broad example for all alcohol. But we will save that for now so we can take questions.
Thank you so much, Chacham, for that very well organized and insightful shiur. If anyone has any questions, they can raise their hand, write in the chat box, unmute. Simon says diminished responsibility. Maybe that was the word you were looking for.
The term I was looking for was a Latin term for a person who has no mental faculties. Something mentis.
Non compos mentis.
Thank you. Yes,
that's
the term.
From Simon.
Okay, thank you. A non compos mentis. That's the word. So that's the Latin equivalent of Adam shehigia l'shichruto shelot.
I have a question on. I never understood the position of the Meiri. The outcome may be nice, but just practically, if it's a chiyuv in terms of Sauda, then it's a chiyuv. This samchut of the Talmud, meaning like next to it is an agarita that shows us the dangers of drinking. How does that have the power to get rid of a chova? And if it's not a chova, because it's just a nice idea that we should drink, then in the first place you don't need to be challenged by the idea, meaning you don't need to bring it up. So, meaning if it has authority, then how does the agarita have the power to throw it off? And if it's not an aspect of seuda, then great, wonderful.
So I think that in itself is the reason why there's machloket about it, because you have an agarita that comes after this memra, that's a statement of halacha. So what does one have to do with the other? The agada should, in theory, not negate it. But obviously, that was not the position that some Rishonim accepted. Some Rishonim understood that the Gemara's trying to tell you that there was a takana to engage in the seudah in a manner of becoming somewhat drunk, but it no longer applies. You may think it applies, but it no longer applies for that reason. I think, my opinion, I think the Gemara is like Harambam, like the Rif and the Rosh and others, is still keeping the element of drinking to the point where one is drunk on some level on during the Seudah. That's not being negated. But why is the Gemara bringing you this agada of Rabbi Zera and Rabbah afterwards? It's to warn you not to get carried away. It's not coming to negate the chiyuv. It's coming to tell you there is a chiyuv, but tread lightly. Please do so responsibly. And proof of that, by the way, maybe it's not proof, but one of the biggest challenges for Rabbi Shimon HaMeiri and for the Meiri is the position that most Rishonim take, that Divrei Kabbalah, institutions that were put in place by the Nevi'im, have a hierarchy of sorts against those takanot and gezerot that were put into place by Chachamim later on. That is a machloket harishonim, though. So if you do accept that position, then there's no way to undo that which the Megillah says, that it's Yom Mishteh v'Simcha. Mishteh, by definition, includes drinking, right? So you can't undo that. Others say no. Divrei soferim are divrei soferim. If it's not deoraita, then it by default falls into category 2, which are quote unquote rabbinically instituted takanot or gezerot. That machloket ties into the I don't want to say the severity, the level of importance that Megillah reading has during the night and during the day. So if you take a look at the Rishonim on this sugya, and it's also brought down as a machloket between Maran and the Rama, the Megillah reading of the day and of the evening are equated by Maran. There's no preference given to one or the other, whereas the Rama adopts the position that the daytime reading is in fact more important because that was an institution of Mordechai and Esther. These days, not these nights. Only Chachamim later instituted the Megillah reading of the evening. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, and I think it makes more sense, Lifian Yudati, according to the other Rishonim, not the main.
I agree with you.
Yeah.
I agree with you.
Yeah. The other question is that in the Rambam, he himself has words built in language that he has to speak about different levels of shichrut. Then why does he say liot shikor, which is the highest level according to him in Chot Tefillah, when he could have used the words shatui, which is what Le Besume would have achieved?
So, if I recall correctly, the reason for that is because in Ilchot Tefillah there are two standards of acceptability with regard to what a person drinks. One is being a shikor, where a person is asur, he's not allowed to pray. If he goes ahead and he prays the Amidah anyway, he's still yotzeh, right? That's the argument that some make. And obviously, if he reaches the point of shichruto shelot, that's then l'chol deot he would not be yotzeh. But the level beneath that, which is just a shatui, or I guess you could say for our purposes, one who is mitpasem, perhaps is allowed to pray even the chatchila. I don't know. I have to give that some thought. That I would have to give that some thought.
If I'm not mistaken, I think he said that's also a toiva.
But is he yotzeh?
No, he's a yotzeh if he's a shatui. He's not yotzeh if he's a shikor.
So that's exactly what I'm saying. That's exactly what I'm saying.
That's both of the meaning. So, but that's what I'm saying is that if for the Rambam, shikor is really the big problem always.
Yes.
Then he should use the terms that he himself created, meaning the categories that he himself used, and just say shatui. A person has a chiyuv to be shatui during the Seudah.
Okay, that's a fair point. That's a very, very good point. In other words, Harambam makes a distinction between a shatui and a shikur in Hilchot Tefillah. If he wanted to use the lower term of intoxication for Hilchot Purim, he would have done so, but he doesn't.
Right.
You could maybe make the argument that the sleeping does away with that. So a person can be a shikor, but not act upon it because of the shena. Because you'll notice that Harambam also adds ache yiradem.
Yeah.
So I think that would probably answer your question. It could be that a person does reach the level of shichrut, but it's not considered a terrible thing because it's there's no way to act on it if you're sleeping. But that would do away with the that would be a challenge to the Korban Netanel's theory of bisum. Um, I'll concede to that point. Yeah, that is a challenge to Korban Netanel.
Right. EK?
Any other questions?
Let's see. Okay. We'll close it for the night there. I mean, there's so much more to go on. There's so many good sources you brought, so there's a lot to discuss. So just for the sake of time, we'll wrap it up. 1 second. Someone comment? No. Okay. So we'll wrap it up. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here live. Thank you so much, everyone who is going to be listening after. Chacham, thank you so much for being with us, even while you're traveling. A lot of dedication to us. And we'll see you for next week for the final installment of our series.
Always looking forward to it. Have a wonderful evening, everybody.
Bye bye.